welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including two different takes on the mainstream media and how they're going to deal with this post-Trump time, or more importantly, the post-2024 election, as well as one article talking about Trump's plans to actually tariff nations that may be considering a move to the BRICS currency. And, of course, we will end today with our Daily Delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling from me. Let's jump in to our daily debate. So, when it comes to a post-2024 time period, where we look a little bit further down the road, let's even say 2026, 2027, is the mainstream media as powerful as it is now? Does it regain any of its former glory? Is that possible? Do you think it won't collapse at all? Do you think it will fully collapse? I mean, there's a little bit of bias in the way that I ask that question because it makes it seem like it will fall, but maybe it won't, and I would love to hear what your opinions are now. With that said, let's jump into our first article, which comes from National Review. Headline reads, "Tectonic plates are shifting. Mainstream media facing upheaval after Trump's big win." So, for anyone who pays attention, you're sure, if you're on the left or the right, you're sure to have seen the MSNBC Morning Joe going and quote-unquote bowing to Trump, however the left and the right like to frame it. Oh, it's, Morning Joe, these people that were kind of with Donald Trump at the very beginning, and now they're coming out against him during the course of his 2018, 2019, 2020 years. And when he's out of office, they're still attacking him and the right. And then, especially throughout this last election, they're coming out hard. But then, as everything settles, as he wins, they go to Mar-a-Lago and they bend the knee. However you want to frame it, it does speak to an underlying truth, which is these people have to adapt to the environment they're living in. Now, people like Brian Stelter would probably say, well, they're actually afraid of repercussions, of reprisals from Donald Trump for all their negative coverage. And people on the right would say, well, they're realizing that the bread is actually buttered on that side of the maybe audience is the best way to put it. But I would say a better way to frame it is the bread is buttered having more conversations that include that side of the aisle. MSNBC has gone down the anti-Trump road for a long time. I would say that they are the anti-Trump network at this point. CNN is also very anti-Trump, but at least they have some baseline good reporting underneath them. MSNBC is the place of the talking heads and the place that says we don't like Trump, from Rachel Maddow all the way down to, of course, Morning Joe. So they're realizing that the environment's shifting, that there has to be an extra pull to bring people into MSNBC because there's already been an anti-Trump push from these people for a long time. It obviously didn't work. It was getting them ratings, and maybe you could make the argument that they should stay on this track in order to continue to harvest all the seeds that they have sown in the population of, hey, Trump is the most evil, Trump is terrible. But I think they're realizing that there's a genuine shift happening within the populace, or at least within the voting demographics, that is leaning Trump, and maybe to actually capture it to be relevant to not just that one side that hates Trump, but also try to bring in other people they need to shift. Well, they've already ruined their reputation with those people, so they shouldn't necessarily go back on everything they've been saying, because as it's commonly pointed out, why would you go and talk to somebody who you basically call an authoritarian, a totalitarian, potential dictator? Why would you go and bend the knee to them if you truly thought they were that evil? No, you have to be the resistance. You have to continue to push back. So maybe they should have just stuck to their guns, but they didn't. So now we have to truly understand what the ramifications of it are going to be, especially with MSNBC possibly being spun off by Comcast. So let's go to a quote from this article. Quote, "That the media ultimately had little influence on voters should come as little surprise. Just 31% of respondents in a Gallup poll last month said they have a great deal or a fair amount of trust in the press, an all-time low." Now, as columnist John Perhorowitz writes, "It seems like a tectonic plates are shifting," end quote. This is what you bring upon yourself. Now, let's be clear. I am not saying that any other particular news source should be any more trusted. I'm not saying the Fox News of the world tells you the truth. I'm not telling you the Newsmaxes of the world tell you the truth. I'm not telling you that CNN or MSNBC tell you the truth. But when one specific news agency, a legacy news agency, can be so spun to be so adamantly against one person, to be an entire machine to basically discredit him and his political movement, it shows you how a news agency can be weaponized. If any lesson comes out of the MSNBC years versus the Trump years, it should be that you need to have less faith in the people providing you information. You have to be more skeptical. We have been told this. My generation has been told this, whether it be Google or Google Chrome specifically, because we are overly reliant on it. We look things up, and especially nowadays with summarizers, we have to double check. They're AI summarizers. You have to be skeptical. You have to continue to do your own research. This has always been the case, but during the early years of television, and when there were just 3 basic networks, there was a perception that these news agencies, these 3-letter networks, were providing you relevant information with as little spin as possible. Everybody's biased, everybody brings their own thing to the table, but it was kind of ingrained in the population that these were truly good faith news organizations. And now, when you have a world where opinions are rampant, where perspectives flow freely, and where information is spread at such a rapid pace, you do run into a place where there are constant clashes of information and worldview, and you have to be skeptical of that. And for the people that didn't realize this before, whether they like Trump or not, having this example of MSNBC go rampantly after Trump elucidated to the people that do like Trump, okay, this can be weaponized in order to reach a certain means. And then for the people who don't like Trump, who went to MSNBC and then see Joe and Mika go and bend the knee, that shatters the illusion that these people are being objective, but rather that they're seeking their own ends, they're seeking their own advertising dollars. They're trying to get as many views as possible. They're playing into the narrative that they think will get them money, and it shatters the idea that they're truly objective, because if you were truly objective before when reporting that he is basically a tyrant, and you believe that because it's objective fact, because that's what some people believe MSNBC is to be reporting, then you shatter the illusion when you go and you bend the knee to him. Because if it truly was an objective fact that he was a tyrant, why, like I said before, why would you go and see him? So it is the shattering of the bubble. It is the destruction of the confines of information that have held so many people of this nation hostage. And I think it's fascinating when the right is sitting over here saying, this is a good thing. I'm not saying that it's not a good thing, but I always find it fascinating when the right says, you can't trust these outlets. They're not telling you the truth. And then they pitch their own outlets, which also provide opinions which they proffer as the truth, the underlying quintessential truths of the world. Sometimes they tell things that are actually true about the world, or at least can be believed or can be inherent to some people's worldview. A lot of these right-wing organizations, they say that people are inherently bad, and that government and the systems that are created in order to govern people need to hem in these worse impulses. Society, the culture that we bring our children into, have to be capable of roughing out those edges, or smoothing out those rough edges. And that is something that not everybody agrees with. People on the left will not agree with that. So when people on the right hear that, if they're predisposed to actually have that worldview, they're going to find themselves in a new bubble. So it's funny when they say, well, MSNBC, all these other organizations, they were creating these false bubbles, they were lying to people, and yet they're creating systems, new systems that they profit from, that actually also create bubbles. And let's be clear. You're never going to have a truly unbiased news agency, but especially you can try. But in these day and ages, the profit motives are not there. The profit motives are to appeal to people where they're at and try to convince other people who are close to come along in order to get money from them. So instead of actually ripping down those systems of perceived or falsely perceived objective truth and proffering something that does bring the objective truth with both sides. They are simply bringing forth an alternative which will simply make the bubble a little bit smaller, but more highly concentrated in the type of people that would agree with you. It's very fascinating. Obviously, I recommend that everybody go listen to the MSNBCs of the world, go listen to the Fox News of the world, go listen to the Newsmaxes, go listen to the Young Turks, listen to Kyle Kalinske, listen to the Breaking Points, listen to the Ben Shapiros, the Dave Rubins, probably the Joe Rogans, the Lex Fridmans. Bring in all these different sources of information and fully synthesize them. Go read some beautiful books. Read some Noam Chomsky. Whether or not you like him, whether or not you agree or like him, he definitely has interesting theories about how we, I don't want to say manufacture consent because that's just the name of the book, how we alter the environments we live in order to convince other people that our worldview is correct, and how governments and broader society try to limit perspectives in order to regulate what is allowed and not allowed. But all of these things, all these different pieces of information, you have to bring them together and synthesize them. You cannot trust one as the only source. That is how it always should be. You should be finding pieces of content where people disagree with you. And very often, I don't always enjoy listening to the content where people disagree with me because they make me ask bigger questions. Sometimes I'm able to purely and easily defend my point of view, or at least formulate a counter argument, think through what they're telling me. And sometimes it's harder, but that is the beauty of living. You have to, or you should, be willing and able to take on alternative perspectives. And in order to live in a society where everybody's going to have different views, you have to be open to at least hearing them. Not agreeing with them, but at least hearing them. So that's why I think the downfall of the mainstream media, the trusted sources, though it will probably push some of the people on the left further down to the left, it will also make them question whether or not these services that they've been listening to were always giving them the objective truth, and just may, cause them to branch out into other places that have some libertarian voices, that have some conservative voices, and maybe will create a more robust, or allow them to create a more robust system of information gathering. That is what I hope for out of this. And that's what I think a lot of the moderate people are hoping for in this situation. And I don't necessarily think the right's 100% there. I think a lot of the right is wanting, at least the new right, that has this infrastructure that they've been building up for years upon years. I think that they genuinely want to court those people over to their side and lock them into the bubble. Then again, there are plenty of commentators who are willing to take on alternate perspectives, really engage in these conversations that would seem uncomfortable, but bring to the front of the conversation these disagreements rather than just the places where everybody agrees on the right. But they actually want to bring forward the arguments of another side, or at least a alternate version of the same thinking, in order to truly have these discussions. And in an age of populism, in an age where the status quo is being degraded, and forcefully so, this is essential. We cannot go forward truly solely based on a populist movement that does not understand what it wants. That doesn't mean that we can't have great leaders who tell us ways forward and we can agree or disagree. But if we're going to have a populist era, that populace has to know to some degree what they want and where they're going, so they are not led astray by, if you want to put it biblically, false prophets, but if you want to put it in pure practical political terms, led by people who only have their own self-interest in mind. And that is why an educated populace, a populace that engages with the MSNBCs but also the Foxes, is ultra important. And that's why when you see the possible degrading of the mainstream media, I see a opportunity for a brighter information system future. That doesn't mean it's going to come. It doesn't mean it's 100%. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed. But one can hope. But that is the optimistic, the more, I don't want to say neutral, but at least that is the perspective of someone who is willing to watch these systems degrade a little bit, watch the silos come down, watch the bubbles burst, in order to hope that there is a broader synthesis of information rather than them all being stuck in their own little areas that they're not willing to share, they're not willing to cross streams, so to speak. The bubbles never interact, they just bounce off of each other rather than creating larger communities when those two bubbles come together and actually start to synthesize information. But with that said, there is an alternative perspective, which is the side that doesn't like the shattering of these systems. And I think it's a really interesting article that came from Daily Costs. The headline reads, "The Los Angeles Times has caved a second time." Now, for those who do not remember, the Washington Post did not come out with an endorsement during the election, and neither did the Los Angeles Times. And for the people who were very passionate readers of the Washington Post and Los Angeles Times, most of them tend to be more liberal in leaning, especially the ones that were actually subscribed to them rather than the ones that would occasionally buy the paper. They were not happy with this. They believed that they had to make their voice heard, that they had to help guide their readership in the right direction, especially the ones that hated Donald Trump and wanted Kamala Harris to win. There, in this case, specifically with these two comparisons, this would be part of the population that actively wants to prop up the system that is in place. At least at Morning Joe, Joe Scarborough, Mika, went and said, okay, we understand that we've been in this bubble. We're going to at least try to bridge the gap now. We're not going to agree with Donald Trump, but we at least want to make sure that we will have access to him in order to actually debate his ideas rather than being totally shut out, if I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. Those are people that are realizing the system has failed and that they need to take a new approach and possibly one that would actually be better. Versus what I would say in this case is somebody who wants to prop up an old system that benefited them but only for so long. Now let's actually get into what this article is saying. I'm going to read from the second paragraph here. Quote, "Now the Times is hiring Scott Jennings, a conservative commentator on CNN. His counterpoint on CNN has consisted of whitewashing Trump's insanity. Jennings is going to be joining the editorial board at the Times. This is part of a disturbing trend in news media. First, the Los Angeles Times did not endorse Kamala Harris for president over the objections of the editorial board, as did the Washington Post." So, what they're not enjoying here is adding more conservative voices. What they're saying is this conservative worldview, in essence, is not even worthy of airing out. It is not even worth bringing a person who may have contra views to my own and allowing them to actually have their opinions heard in op-eds, in opinion pieces in the Los Angeles Times. And my question would be, if you know that there is a segment of the population that wants Donald Trump based on, you can say not even popular vote, but electoral vote, and the fact that he came out so far ahead of Kamala Harris, does that not mean that he brings something to the table that she does not, or that she does not bring enough to the table, which means there are people that are genuinely interested in that point of view, at least in rhetoric alone? Why would you not, if you're a free market system, why would you not say, okay, hey, we see a little bit of uptick in conservative politics and people actually interested in this. Maybe we should bring those people along. Purely from a free market standpoint, it only makes sense in this case when the supply for conservative ideas is up to bring on someone that is conservative. Now, is the demand for this conservative talking head, but he's a talking head on CNN. He would be an editorial writer at the Los Angeles Times. Is that demand enough to actually outweigh the demand for a purely liberal newspaper? We'll see. The Washington Post lost lots of subscribers when they did not come out and endorse for the election. So we'll see if the readership for the Los Angeles Times goes down as well. But regardless of the free market, this, in my opinion, is a great example of people not accepting the era that we live in. They don't accept that people can go beyond the normal institutions in order to get viewpoints that may be a little bit contradictory to the mainstream or may not be held by certain segments of the population. Not even saying they have to be in the mainstream, but the more touted, loudly broadcasted views. Guess what? If anybody in Los Angeles wants a conservative opinion, they can go to the Wall Street Journal because they have conservatives on their editorial board. You can go to the New York Times, which has quasi-conservatives on their editorial board. You can go to random websites online, National Review, Daily Wire, Daily Caller. You can go to all these different random websites, and even Business Insider sometimes, though it leans liberal most of the time, has some conservative articles, especially when it comes down to free market economics and when it comes to the stock market. But my point being that there are so many alternatives that you have to respond. You have to realize that the bubble is slowly being degraded. You can't keep these people here simply because you don't want them to leave and because you don't believe that the alternative point of view is worth broadcasting. That's not going to actually maintain a healthy readership. And you may be saying, Alex, this feels a little bit off point. What I'm getting at is these people at daily cost, but also the critics of the Los Angeles Times, they cannot even imagine what a world outside their bubble would look like, which is why they cannot understand why this would actually be a good thing, why this would be a good business move, but also in general, why it would be a good thing to have alternative perspectives at the newspaper. Because guess what? Adding an extra conservative voice to the editorial board maybe leans it with maybe two outwardly loud conservatives, and even then they're California conservatives for the most part. So my point being that the bubble has so enclosed upon these people that looking beyond it no longer appears to be an option. They can't even imagine why you would want to leave your beautiful walled garden. It's so great in here. We have all the best opinions here. We have all the left-leaning opinions here. Why would you need anything else? And I know maybe I'm not being generous enough. Maybe I'm not giving them the benefit of the doubt. But it is hilarious when you see people who don't want to shatter the current illusion of fair media coverage because it benefits them or because they cannot imagine what an alternative would actually look like. So those are the first two stories that really talk about the mainstream media, but also, more importantly, media in general and how it's shifting as we come out of a relatively large Trump win. Now, I want to move on to our final article that actually talks about Trump in office. This one comes from Axios. Headline reads, Trump threatens 100% tariffs on BRICS nations over dollar. So for those of you who do not know what the BRICS nations are, you're talking about Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, who are trying to come together, and essentially all of these countries are buying up large sums of gold. And in theory, the idea is that they will be able to have their own currency that they use in order for trading, basically a denomination that they use for international trade that is backed by gold. That's the theory, at least. And it is seen by some as a challenge to the dollar if they're able to get it off the ground. Now, just like some people, and for those of you who haven't kept up with the last few episodes, that's fair enough, Trump has talked about having a large amount of tariffs leveled against any imports that come into the United States of America. And as we discussed previously, some people believe this is more of a negotiating tactic. Some people believe that this is something that he genuinely wants to do because he saw good results, at least when it came to China during his administration. I think it is more realistic to believe that Donald Trump will end up using them as negotiating tools, or at least he knows that by threatening them, he can get better deals. But also, I do believe that he has enough previous history with tariffs to see that they can be successful when it comes to strategic industries, and that's why he genuinely believes that tariffs are important. But also because he talks about increasing American manufacturing. If you want to just use tariffs as a tool for negotiation, then that's not necessarily going to actually bring back jobs to America. If you have tariffs and you are actually increasing the cost of goods coming from other countries, then in theory, those companies might want to open a factory here in the United States because it'll be cheaper to produce that product domestically, and we're obviously offsetting the higher costs of labor. But the point being that in theory, those higher tariffs can encourage people, one, to build factories here, companies that already exist outside the United States start manufacturing in the U.S., and also it can encourage other companies to not export their manufacturing to places like China, Canada, a lot of car companies are doing those sort of things, or China, so that they don't have to deal with those higher prices when they're importing those pieces back into the United States and having the cars assembled here. The point I'm getting at is whether or not it is a strategic move, it is a bargaining chip, or it is a genuine belief, it is something that is most definitely on the docket and is being talked about a great deal. I've talked about it a great deal because I hate the idea of so many tariffs. I think it's an infringement on free trade, and obviously if costs are too high to produce things here, then we have to have a comparative advantage in other sectors, financial, technology, STEM, and we have to continue to develop those, and we have to find other ways to have a comparative advantage as our raw labor pool actually decreases but also becomes more expensive. Or in some cases can increase as well, but that's besides the point. What I'm getting at the end of the day is when he talks about these 20% tariffs on everything, that's one aspect of the tariff agenda. This next one is specifically aimed at destroying or at least undermining the BRICS currency before it gets its feet underneath them in order to keep the American dollar on top. Whether or not this is actually a prudent strategy, I'll have to have a little bit more time to deep dive into, but also have to see some of the repercussions and how many countries have actually adopted the BRICS currency, which is very little, if none. But that doesn't mean that these countries, like I said, have not been prepping, because they have been buying gold in order to at least appear as though they're ready to bring this currency online in the future, and they're at least preparing to. Then again, you could also argue that that's a negotiating tactic on their point. They're basically saying, well, hey, America, if you don't treat us right here, we've already been buying up all this gold in order to back up this independent currency that would not be based on the US dollar. Maybe you should not have these sort of policies where you actually deflate your currency and therefore make it harder for us as buyers and sellers to actually get redemptions on the debts that you owe us. Because if the bonds that they bought say that they're for $5,000. So let's put it in these terms. If you buy a bond and the redemption value is $1,000, so basically you give $1,000 ahead of time, the U.S. government takes that like, oh, yay, woo, and you owe them $1,000 in the future, plus interest. Well, if you just keep inflating the currency, $1,000 has less purchasing power than it did when that bond was initially issued. So that is a way to get out of paying debts, but it really infuriates, or at least in theory, it makes it easier to pay off those debts, but it infuriates those other countries because the value of the dollar compared to their currency has gone down. So even when they get that exact redemption value plus interest of the bond back, they're not able to convert it to a similar or more amount of yen or rupee or anything of that sort. But also, if they want to keep it in-house and buy things in America, well, they actually can buy less with those dollars than they could have when they initially had gone and gotten the bond from the United States government. So they might want to be able to have some sort of leverage to protect against these sort of things, and that's why they create their own currency that's backed in gold, in theory, or at least majority backed in gold, so they can use it as a negotiating tool to say, hey, these sort of policies are actually hyperinflationary. We do not want you to carry through on these sort of things because almost all trade around the world at least has some US dollar backing, and it's actually hurting us when you start inflating your currency this way. So it could be a negotiating tool on their end. Well, now Donald Trump's coming back and saying, whoa. You want to try to move away from the U.S. dollar? You want to try to move away from American supremacy? Not in my case. Guess what? We're going to tariff the poop out of you. And here's how it goes. President-elect Trump on Saturday threatened to impose 100% tariffs against emerging markets that try to shift away from the U.S. dollar in international trade. Why it matters. The threat against BRICS nations, primarily Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, that spells out BRICS, is the latest escalation in Trump's campaign to use the specter of tariffs to achieve policy goals. And do I believe that it's a negotiating tactic? Possibly. But also I do believe it is a genuine threat, because I think Trump sees this potential lack of the dominance of the U.S. dollar, especially as there's starting to be an untethering of U.S. dollars to oil prices. The petrodollar has propped us up for quite some time. he's seeing the state of things. He's seeing the U.S. dominance possibly falling, and he is trying to make a desperate clutch at power on the international stage. Because right now, our military supremacy is one thing, but you could argue that China has more boats in their navy than we do. Then again, ours are more sophisticated, but also we haven't fought active wars as often. There's lots of different projections and ways you can cut against the U.S. Army or even the Chinese Army, the People's Liberation Army of China. There's plenty of ways you could cut against them and make arguments that either one is the more powerful military player. But economically, there's no doubt that the U.S. is weaker than it has been in the past. Then again, compared to everybody else coming out of COVID, we've done relatively okay. Inflation's still been really high. You've seen other nations be able to cut back on or increase the interest rates and maybe curb back inflation a little bit faster. But if we lose our economic dominance, which is the current place where we lead besides China, if you do it by GDP, if you do other factors based on unemployment, useful resources, value of the currency. There are other ways that you can break it down, but there's no doubt that we're at least on top and undermining the U.S. dollar because it is used almost anywhere around the world for easy transacting, just like the Great British Pound was before. It could lead to the downfall. And I think Trump genuinely wants to stop that. So we're going to see how this one plays out. I don't know if the BRICS nations will fold, especially with a backer like China and India, who doesn't want to necessarily be. They could see themselves as another superpower on the rise, especially as they have the largest population in the world currently. Do they want to be beholden to the United States as they're trying to become a regional power in Asia and possibly one of the next superpowers of the world? These are genuine questions which they will take on when evaluating whether or not to take on the 100% tariff that Trump is threatening. But it's most definitely a conversation we have to continue to monitor because this is a recurring theme with him. He loves his tariffs. He loves punishing people that get out of line, and he sees tariffs as a great tool to do that. But also, as some people argue, he could also see it as a great tool in order to negotiate. So with that said, we'll leave it there. If you want to read any of the articles, the full things, all the links will be in the description below that like and subscribe button. But before we fully end, let's go to our daily delight. This one comes from Axios as well. DC Zoo Librites that are just as cute as Modang. And this is a little ape. He has some hay over his shoulder. It's the first photo you see when you read this article. It talks about all the other animals that are actually on display at the zoo and how, the pandas may not be here yet, but there are cute options. So if you're in the DC area, maybe you read this and you go by some of the enclosures and see what's going on. But now with that, like I said, all of the stories will be linked in the description below the like and subscribe button. If you want to check out the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, the links will also be in the description. If you want to hear the Twitter tirade, that comes out every Tuesday and Thursday over on the Twitter handle, Your DailyFlip. And if you stay here on Tuesdays, if you come back to this YouTube channel, or if you're listening on the RSS feed, you come back here, you will catch our international news segment 6 in 6. 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. So, with all that said, there's only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.